Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Africa podcast, where we get behind the news from the continent and in this week's episode, the world. Talking Africa is brought to you by the Africa Report magazine, which you can always check out online at theafricareport.com. Now, as people across the world continue to do what it takes to battle the coronavirus, a new battle has taken place following the death of George Floyd, an African-American who was killed in a matter of 8 minutes by police in yet another case of abuse of power and racism against Black people in the United States. To look at the far-reaching effects of this uprising and what role it plays for Africa, if any, against racism and also against police brutality, we invite 3 leading thinkers of today to offer their thoughts and analysis on what is taking place. Nana Ama Danquah, a Ghanese author of Willow Weep for Me and editor of the upcoming anthology Acre Noir, she joins us from Los Angeles. Zukisa Wanner, a South African author and founder of the recently held virtual literary festival Afrodite Sans Frontières. Her most recent novel is Africa, a True Book, that came out last year in 2019. She joins us from Nairobi in Kenya. And Veronique Tadjo, an Ivorian writer, academic, and painter. Born in Paris, she grew up in Côte d'Ivoire. Her most recent novel is En compagnie des hommes, or In the Company of Men, which is due to be translated into English soon. She joins us from London. This podcast is moderated by our own Patrick Smith.
This week we're running the Africa Report podcast in response to what appears to be the seismic events in the United States and how they're reverberating around the world. And the idea for this discussion came from an initiative from the Afrolite group. And one of the leaders of that initiative was Zukisa Wanner, and they brought 108, I believe, African writers together to write an open letter in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, which has been organizing these national protests against the police murder of George Floyd. And the protests have reverberated around the world. We've seen demonstrations now in several African countries. We've seen demonstrations in France, in Germany, in Britain, and many other countries now. And we're recording this on the day after the memorial service to George Floyd in Minnesota, and will be the first of many others. What we want to try to do this morning is to tease out what this moment means for both the system in the United States, the criminal justice system in the United States, but also the prospects for political, economic, and social change around the world, particularly in Africa. So, Kiswa, could I start with you and ask you, to what extent do you see the global protests against the police killing of George Floyd as some sort of turning point, kind of a catalyst for change, both in the United States criminal justice system and beyond, but also in the global power balance around the world?
I think it's been interesting to watch, to be honest, because one of the first things that happened after we'd written the protest letter, and the signatures are now at about 135, more people are asking to be added in. After we'd written that, stories then started coming. I mean, we've always known about, in our own particular sports, about the violence that the police made towards the state, made towards the people as well, you know. So even in our countries, in African countries, Black lives do matter. And there have been some examples in Nigeria, for instance, where a young man was on a holiday with a woman who happened to be British, but they named the British woman. They gave her, you know, the two of them ended up being killed. The British woman ended up being named. They ended up being given a life, but the Nigerian guy was just othered. Similarly, over here in Kenya, when Al-Shabaab has in the past destroyed things and killed people and kidnapped people, generally when it has been the police or the soldiers who work for the states, they've been ignored. But it took their kidnapping, I think, two Italian terrorists for Kenya to decide to go to war in Somalia. So there are a lot of dynamics on this, and watching it also has brought to the attention what's happening with the Afro-Brazilians and how they're marginalized, and it's just brought up a whole lot of different things. But now people are strategizing, at least some of the people that I've been talking to, how do we show solidarity beyond talk? How do we say we need to do more, not just to the US, not just to Brazil, but to our own governments, So yeah, and I think if this momentum doesn't get lost, there is going to be a truly seismic shift.
You mentioned about your own government, Zukisa. In South Africa, I know the African National Congress put out a condemnation of the police killing of George Floyd pretty quickly after it happened. And others within South Africa have said, yeah, fine, that's a good thing. But what is going on within South Africa? Because during the pandemic and during the lockdown in South Africa,
the police have killed
authorities
5 people.
themselves have become, how many people? 9?
I think it was 9 last I checked. Yes, yeah. They have become a law unto their own. And again, they'll go into a situation where we've had Cape Town having crazy people breaking curfew and not adhering to what, and usually there are white joggers and they're told, okay, please just go home, get in the way. Whereas whenever it's a black person who does that, they're beaten, they're killed, their lives do not count, and there isn't that same reaction. There isn't that same I guess justification and stuff, and explanation and sympathy and empathy by our very own black government. And it's not the only place where it's been happening. Even here in Kenya, people have been beaten up for missing curfew. I haven't heard of any deaths yet, though, but I know definitely that there have been people who've been beaten up really badly for missing curfew, and our curfew starts at 7.
So is there a sense that the militarized police response in South Africa is a kind of hangover from apartheid? There's a sort of militarization ethos within the police and security forces in South Africa that hasn't really been reformed.
It certainly is. I mean, we saw it in with the Marikana killings, how even after the mine workers decided to move themselves to a certain place, the police came and cordoned off the place and killed them, and shot them and it was exactly like the scenes that you would see during apartheid in the townships, in the different areas that held a whole lot of black people. So there is a need for reform. There is absolutely, and I suspect that's part of the reason why in the last elections, Julius Maleba's EFF gained even more votes than before. And for those who weren't comfortable with Malema, why there were just also less voters that went to the poll. And I think you're also even seeing it now in the US, where people are saying, well, the Democrats are very much a lot like the Republicans as well. So why should we vote?
Veronique, you as a writer, an intellectual university professor, you've lived in South Africa as well as La Côte d'Ivoire, and I know you've written extensively about the genocide in Rwanda, but other instances of police and military abuse. I wondered how you saw the internationalization of this issue of police violence and oppression, because in this week, and I know you're a frequent visitor to Paris and France, this week we've seen mass street protests in Paris against the death in police custody of Adama Traore. Mm-hmm. And he is one of many young black men who have been killed in police custody in France. And despite the promises of the Macron government of La Nouvelle Police, that policy seems to have failed to deliver. We've seen sequence of demonstrations across France in recent months. Of course, the Gilets jaunes, the sans-papiers demonstrations just down the road from where I'm living. There was a big sans-papiers demonstration at La Place de République on Saturday. Despite the lockdown, people are really angry and feel that people without immigration documents are being victimized in this pandemic. I wondered how you felt that France is going to react to this and the French system, and how that will play into the relations between France and Francophone countries in Africa.
I wasn't surprised, and I'm not surprised that this has taken on a global dimension. I think it's about, as Zukisa said, it's about police brutality in general, but police brutality geared towards marginalized people. It just happens that, for example, if you take France, you've got the banlieue, which is a kind of a ghetto where all the blacks, people of North African origins, and basically all the non-100% French find themselves. And of course, it creates an unhealthy atmosphere. And then when the police gets into these neighborhoods, it's always with too much brutality, because there's a lot of tension. But I also think that we have to understand this in the context, definitely in the context of the pandemic. Why it has taken on so widely, I mean, why it has become a global phenomenon, is because everybody can understand now what it means to be confined, to be isolated, to be told what to do, to be in a way brutalized by the situation and by the power that the governments all over the world have had and still have over our lives. So I think that there is a general rebellion or resistance against what has been happening during these last months since the pandemic started. And everybody can understand better now what it means to be really at the wrong end of policing.
Because Veronique, you were a signatory to another letter, open letter, which was this time to African governments, but it was in the context of the pandemic. And the letter essentially was saying African governments must seize the time of this pandemic to rethink politics and economics and culture within Africa, and to make those big investments in public health, to make investments in education, and to free up the intellectual space in Africa as well, and to change the relations between Africa and the rest of the world, particularly the former colonial powers. I wondered if you could just tell us what kind of response there was to that, and how this concentration of protest around police violence and so on might feed into that right now.
I think that it's the same it's the same thing, really, because if you're going to in terms of managing the pandemic in Africa, if you're going to mimic everything that's happening in the West, and then this big issue of the lockdown or the curfews in the case of Africa, where you put people who the marginalized, as I say again, in a position which is absolutely impossible to carry on. That means if you tell people who are working in the informal sector that they can't continue to carry on with their livelihood, it's not going to happen. So we're left with, again, police brutality to enforce something that is unenforceable, because you put